Well, hello and welcome everyone to our webinar series. This is our 12th. It's so hard to believe that we only have 2 left in our webinar series titled Post-Philosophies and the Doing of Inquiry. This is a free webinar series with a total of 14 sessions, and this is the 12th. We meet monthly on the topic of post-qualitative inquiry and the doing of inquiry inspired by a range of post-philosophies. Each session involves 1 or 2 international guests who have experience with inquiry approaches inspired by post-philosophies such as post-humanism, post-structuralism, affect theories, feminist, new materialisms, post-colonialism, and many more that we've heard from so far. I'm Candace Kuby, and I'm co-hosting this webinar series with Viv Bozalek. We're so glad that you're joining us today. We want to also note that this webinar series is made possible by a collaborative partnership between the University of Missouri System and the University of Western Cape, or UWC, in Cape Town, South Africa. This partnership has been between our universities since 1986. The funding for the webinar series is provided by the University of Missouri South African Education Program Committee, which supports academic exchanges between the University of Missouri System and UWC and provides opportunities for teaching and learning, research, and community engagement between our 2 universities. Viv and I are so grateful for our university's longtime collaboration and the support of this webinar series. Also, these webinars are available on YouTube. You can find them, the way to get to our YouTube channel if you go to the webinars website. Also, while you're watching on YouTube, you're able to select an option for closed captioning to see the written transcript of the webinar. As many of you might know, as you've been attending these series, we're so excited that this will become 2 special issues in the journal Qualitative Inquiry. So over time, our panelists will publish their webinar in an article format. Stay tuned for more information about that. Also, we have updated our website with the exact times for each webinar. As you know, today we had a change in time to accommodate our panelists today. And so just be sure to check because our next webinar with David Ben Shannon is in August, and we'll go back to our usual starting time for that webinar. So I'm excited today to introduce our panelist, Sarah Truman. So Sarah, if you want to unmute and just say a quick hello. And also I want to note that it's very late in the evening for Sarah. And so we are so glad we were able to accommodate the time zones and to have you be a part of our webinar series.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Truman. I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow and lecturer at the University of Melbourne. You can probably hear I have a Canadian accent. From Canada, and then I was in the UK, and then I came here to Australia, and I've been pretty much in lockdown since I arrived here. No, I'm just joking, but it's been a long, a long pandemic. Feeling a little stranded here in Australia, but also pretty safe because there isn't so much COVID here on this continent. We just went back into lockdown again tonight, and there's only 2 cases in the city, so very different pandemic experience than many of you probably had.
Wow. Well, thanks, Sarah. And Viv's going to give a little more lengthy introduction to you a little bit later on so people can know more about your publications and the work that you do. So I do want to introduce Erin Price, who's with us. Erin is a PhD student at the University of Missouri, where she serves as a graduate research assistant with me. Erin is an artist and art educator with experience coordinating preschool through secondary art education in U.S. public schools, as well as community-based art explorations at home and abroad. Erin is particularly interested in the role of material invitations, affect, and artistic encounters in the becomings of identity and community. As many of you know, Erin has been a great support for this webinar series. She helps to provide technical support for the webinar platform. She assists us in moderating the Q&A portions of the webinar. And she's also the artist who provided the beautiful artwork that's on our webinar series webpage and promotional materials. So thank you so much, Erin.
Thank you, Candace. It's my pleasure to introduce our 2 co-hosts, Candace and Viv. Dr. Candace Kuby is the Associate Professor of Learning, Teaching, and Curriculum at the University of Missouri, where she is also Department Chair and Director of Qualitative Inquiry. Dr. Kuby's research interests include the coming to be of literacies when young children work with artistic and digital tools, the approaches to and pedagogies of qualitative inquiry when thinking with post-structural and post-humanist philosophies. And she is the co-author of several books, including Speculative Pedagogies of Qualitative Inquiry, Disrupting Qualitative Inquiry, Possibilities and Tensions in Educational Research, and Posthumanism and Literacy Education, Knowing, Becoming, Doing Literacies. And her scholarship appears in many journals, including Qualitative Inquiry and the Journal of Literacy Research. Dr. Vivienne Bozalek is an emerita professor in women's and gender studies at the University of the Western Cape. She is also an honorary professor at the Center for Higher Education Research, Teaching and Learning at Rhodes University. She holds a PhD from Utrecht University, and her research interests and publications include the political ethics of care and social justice, innovative scholarly practices in higher education, and post-qual and participatory methodologies. Her most recent co-edited books include Post-Anthropocentric Social Work, Critical Posthumanism and New Materialist Perspectives, and Higher Education Hauntologies, Living with Ghosts for a Justice to Come. And both of those are 2021 publications. I am just so thankful to be a part of this series and be able to be with you all here today. So Candace, without further ado, I think you're gonna.
Yeah, thanks, Erin, for those introductions.
Thank
so
you.
just want to give a little overview of the Zoom webinar platform and how the webinar will unfold today. So only our panelists and host have the video and audio functions. As we mentioned earlier, we're recording the webinar for public viewing later on YouTube. So the chat function is open for everyone to connect with today. So if you haven't yet and you'd like to, feel free to say hello and introduce yourself in the chat and use it throughout today to connect with others who are joining. During the Q&A portion, though, we'll be using the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen. So if you haven't located it, you might want to check for that. Feel free to start populating any questions you have throughout the webinar. This will make it easier for myself and Erin to help moderate the Q&A portion a little bit later on. So today's webinar, the structure will be as follows. For the first 30 minutes or so, Sarah has prepared a PowerPoint to talk through those 4 questions that we've been asking all of our panelists. And so we'll share the screen here in just a few minutes and have Sarah talk through those 4 questions with you all with some examples from her scholarship and the projects that she's been a part of. Viv might also ask some questions after that to kind of expand on the suggested reading that Sarah sent, which is a chapter out of a new book, an upcoming book that Sarah's published. And so that's how we'll start our first 30 minutes to 45 minutes. And then we'll also save time at the end, hopefully about 30 minutes, for people to ask questions and to be in dialogue with Sarah about her work. And so Viv, I think if you're ready, if you want to go ahead and do a fuller introduction of Sarah, and then we can jump in to the questions.
Thanks, Candace and Erin. So I'm going to just formally introduce Sarah. She's a postdoctoral research fellow and lecturer at the University of Melbourne, where she researches English literary education, literacies, and speculative fiction. Her forthcoming monograph, Feminist Speculations and the Practice of Research Creation, Writing Pedagogies and Intertextual Affects, will be published in 2022, and we hope it'll come out a little bit before that, by Routledge. And in addition to research in literary education and literacies, Sarah is co-director of the International Research Creation Project, which I'm sure you've all heard of, Walking Lab. And one half, together with David Ben Shannon, of the electronic music duo Oblique Curiosities. And you'll find her projects and publications on her website. And just personally, I wanted to say how excited I am to have you on our series, Truman. I've been a fan of your work for a few years now, and we've read your book, which you wrote with Stephanie in our reading group, and other of your writings. And I've also had a peek at your new book, and I was really drawn in by your personal style. It was so true me that the book, I could hear you talking to me as a reader. And I was riveted by it. It was like reading a novel, difficult to put down. So we're really looking forward to it coming into the public domain. And it's, you know, I've met Trumy at various conferences, where we've had lots of fun, AERA, affect theory, ECQI, and Trumy is also part of our research project on doing academia differently. But unfortunately, due to our present COVID conditions, wasn't able to come here. So I'm still hoping, Trumy, one day before the project comes to an end. But to have you here physically, it would be wonderful. But let's get on to your presentation. I'm looking forward to it. And can you share the screen?
I'll unmute myself and share the screen. Okay, can everybody see that? It's nod. Okay, yeah, so thank you, Viv, Candace, and Erin for inviting me to this series of great research methodologists. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose land I'm zooming to you all from, and this is unceded land. Yeah, it's past 10 p.m. here in Melbourne. I'm going to keep reminding you all what time it is while I go through this. And so I did think in order to be coherent, I would prepare responses to the questions and some exemplifications in the form of a PowerPoint for you today. So I'm sort of interviewing myself according to Viv's and Candace's questions. Okay, so for this interview, as an enabling constraint of sorts, I decided to focus specifically on research creation as it relates to my book that's coming out. And it's a methodology book with a series of exemplifications. It was the suggested reading. I'm not sure if any of you read it. So research creation is growing in popularity in the humanities and social sciences. It's been mobilized as a methodology or a theoretical framework that informs qualitative research, a method or procedure for enacting empirical research. And as a concept, it has a geographic affiliation with Canada. It actually hails from some governing bodies there. It was initially used as a way of acknowledging research projects at the intersections of art, theory, and research. And people are using it around the world now as a term. Stephanie Springay, who was another speaker in this series, I think her talk was back in 2020. She's a leader in the field, and I've collaborated with her for many years on research creation projects, Walking Lab, which Viv mentioned, as well as the Pedagogical Impulse, which she spoke about, I think, in this series. And David Ben Shannon and I also, who's a speaker next month, he also uses research creation, and we collaborate using that concept around music making. And then I thought, well, I'm already acknowledging people I've collaborated with in this fabulous series. I also want to shout out to Elizabeth de Freitas, who I've been thinking in an interdisciplinary way, not so much about research creation, but inspired by a sort of interdisciplinarity, which I think inspires research creation. And we've been doing a lot of thought, thinking around speculative fiction and how it can be mobilized in qualitative research. And she was also in this series. So research creation is transdisciplinary. It's a meeting place of art, theory, and research. As a term, it's not really aligned with a particular theoretical framework. However, many scholars who use the term, and many scholars that I've collaborated with and written about, draw from the feminist materialisms to think about how art, theory, and research emerge. So I would say it is inspired by feminist materialism, especially in how I approach it. So feminism, the word feminism in the feminist materialisms, when mobilized in research creation, understands the need for ethical, theoretical, and artistic rigor throughout the research project. So from planning to dissemination. As Natalie Lovelace, who's a research creation scholar, states, the practice of research creation asks us to, quote, work in alliance with anti-racist and feminist interventions in the academy. So as a transdisciplinary scholar, the concept research creation gave me the permission to draw on my background in English literature and cultural studies and philosophy to inform how I conceptualize research in the social sciences. So that's the sort of transdisciplinary side of it. And so one of the questions that I was asked was, how does your philosophical approach influence your ways of doing inquiry? And I would say my philosophical approach infuses my way of doing inquiry, particularly research creation, which I'm focusing on in this presentation. I also run projects with others that may be deemed more qualitative in a normative sense, but I'm not engaging with those today. But my philosophical approach still infuses them. I find it difficult to separate myself from my philosophical approach. I think research is infused with theory and philosophy. So I thought that the next question that would follow from that would be, if I were interviewing myself, would be, what's my philosophical approach? Or maybe I'd phrase it as, how is my philosophical approach? So my philosophical approach to conducting research is influenced by the feminist materialisms, which I mentioned. So feminist is the advocacy of equity and social justice across diverse sexes, genders, sexualities, classes, races, and abilities. The feminist materialisms is an umbrella term that describes feminist scholarship that activates thought from fields as broad as what I draw from process philosophy, queer and trans studies, speculative pragmatism, and affect theory. I will unpack those more in a minute, but the invocation of these disparate theories does bring up another question that was posed by Viv and Candace, which was, what does this philosophical approach make thinkable or possible in inquiry? So that was the question. To respond to that, I'd say when activated in research practices, these theories disrupt common orientations to research methodology in a variety of ways. They directly implicate researchers or artists in the event of research. They prioritize affect, relationality. They rethink representationalism. And then they recognize that thinking with theoretical concepts or the making or doing of art is also empirical research. So this relates to another question, which I think kind of fold into each other, and I wanted to present this as clearly as possible. And so the question was, what are your perspectives on methodologies and or methods? How do you envision that in your approach to doing inquiry? So that's what I'm going to spend a big chunk of the rest of the presentation talking through. So, and this is outlined in the chapter if you read it. So my methodological orientation is assembled from a variety of sources that I draw together under these terms. So situated speculation, rigorous activation, emergence, affirmation, and refusal, and more than representation. And I build this for myself, drawing on what I've loosely called feminist materialisms, which I discussed above. And before I go on with that, I do want to talk about, in my writing and thinking about methodologies, I engage with a lot of different philosophers and scholars. Some of these philosophers and scholars write about how the material or organic or inorganic world works, or how thought might work. And I appropriate some of these theories to explain how research works for me as a process. I think it's important to recognize the distinction between theories that may endeavor to explain the world in a geologic or material or physical or abstract sense, and how I as a researcher might appropriate a theory to explain my own engagement with research in the arts or education, which many instances may be metaphorical. And Ian Buchanan calls this the subjectification of theory. I was talking to Ian about this when I was working on this chapter, actually, and I thought that was a good phrase. But I'm going to talk you through these concepts that I think about research creation, even though some of them draw from different theories that I'm maybe taking up more metaphorically. So the first one is situated speculation. Following queer feminist theorists and informed by the feminist materialist thinkers, what I call situated speculative thought is an integral part to research. Research creation, like all research, is creative practice and is also in part a speculative process. As an artist or researcher embarks on a project, and throughout the project, they speculate about different time spaces from a particular time space, which is situated, and so doing shape or co-compose what could be. So the differential link between a situated curiosity and speculative potentialities fuels much feminist materialist thought. Situatedness, which is often conceptualized by Donna Haraway, might mean the actual physical location where speculation occurs, but also refers to shifting, inherited, self-identified, and externally forced subject positionalities, including race, gender, class, sexuality, ability, as well as the theoretical positionality, or you could say the concepts that a researcher speculates with. So scholars in the fields of queer and trans studies, critical disability studies, feminist studies, Black and Indigenous studies often mobilize this differential in their art and scholarship. Feminist thought has always been speculative while remaining critically contextualized. A researcher's positionality and intentionality have material effects on what research creation, or you could say whatever research, might produce. And this positionality is constantly being modified by what we read and encounter in the research event. In this regard, the researchers themselves are also in process. So the theories that inform my understanding of situatedness and speculation include the ones listed there. So Deleuze's actual and virtual, which is, I mostly draw from Difference and Repetition, the book. Whitehead's notion of a proposition, which is a situated speculative lure, what could be. So affect theory, broad, big theory, sometimes conceptualized as the capacity to affect and be affected, that sticks to or glides past or infects different research participants or milieus in different ways. Research creation scholar Derek McCormick has argued that the practice of research creation is tethered to, quote, an ethical commitment to learning to become affected, end quote. It's important to remember that this capacity to affect and be affected can vary wildly in different circumstances and situations. So as a scholar, I might pose the question, how can I prime myself to become affected, while also taking into consideration how situated experiences may affect research participants? Queer theory, in this context, I was thinking a lot about like queer temporalities, the link between situatedness and speculation on what could be occupy a queer time space. Queer is a term that's often used as a noun or adjective to describe LGBTQAI plus subject positions, a mode of thought that scholars mobilize when attempting to unsettle normative approaches to method and methodology and the power structures that are reproduced through them. Queer theorists help me think through my approach to research creation projects and methods as situated speculation imbued with affects that unsettle linearity and occupy queer time spaces. So situated speculation, including propositions, affect, queerness, are risky concepts. A researcher isn't certain what's going to emerge in an event, but I want to stress that just because I think with these concepts, I by no means think that research or any research or research creation is an anything goes process. Like all research, there's a planning stage. This is speculative, but it also requires me as a researcher or artist to set some limitations or conditions or constraints in advance and to have some kind of ethico-political tendings that help frame and suffuse the project. Stephanie Springay and I call that our intentions with the in brackets. And these are active throughout the whole process. Okay, so the next movement out of the ones that I'm talking through is rigorous activation. So how do I get from situated speculation to enacting a project? If I'm talking about research creation, which I am right now, then I'm proposing a way to artistically create an event. So a song, a text, a cultural production of what I'm curious about. I figure out how to make an artistic event of what I want to research. That's the creation part. So I'm not talking about investigating something that's already happened. It's completely okay to investigate something that's already happened, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about creating the thing that I want to investigate. As I'll discuss later, sometimes these events occur with other participants, such as I have an example of research in schools with students, and I do lots of work with larger publics with Walking Lab. But sometimes this is a solo artistic project. And I do answer a question at the end about I'll get to that later. Anyway, sometimes it's a solo artistic project. Curating artistic practices that will be activated requires artistic rigor, which usually comes from years of training or practice from myself or my collaborators. And I want to stress that the arts are undermined when they're leveraged in anything goes ways in qualitative research. And I think we need to push back against that if we want the arts to be taken seriously. So curating the theory that is activated in a project is also embedded in the project from the beginning. So for example, I'm going to talk through a project now that I did on the pedagogical and material effects of marginalia. And this project was research creation project with 33 participants that looked at how marginalia and other textual interruptions and interventions might pedagogically affect textual reception. And the text that I used was a series of texts, or a base text that I assembled from a few different writings by Friedrich Nietzsche, mostly around how he came up with the concept of the eternal return and then talking through the eternal return. And that's a fairly significant philosophical concept, and it's kind of haunted me all through since I first encountered it as a PhD student, or no, as when I was doing my bachelor's degree, not as a PhD student. So, but even when I was doing my PhD, it still sort of trickled in, comes up in lots of different other people's writing as well. So this project, the base text has theory embedded in it, but that theory sort of informed how I conceptualized the project. And then of course it suffused the artists and scholars' engagement with the project. And I'm just going to show you some of things that came out of, some of the marginalia that came out of that project. Some of it went more material, some of it went metaphoric, some of it dissolved. That's the front cover of my book. That's Dan Barney and Lam Yao. I think it's pretty. You know, some people Stephanie Springer boiled the broth, boiled it into broth. And some people even rendered it into music. Oops. So the arts practice, the theory, and the research methods are co-imbricated throughout the duration of the project. So that was including the planning, the background reading, the arts practice, and the theorization. So there was lots of different constraints put on it. And then within that, there was a rigor, and then lots of artful and theoretical outcomes, I would say. So this takes me to my next movement of how I think about research creation, which is the concept of emergence. Now, emergence is one of those words that can tip towards sounding really new agey, or even like an anything goes approach, or just like obvious. Of course, things are going to emerge in a research event. And I settled on the term because I like how it invokes the idea of emergency. So I've stuck with it. And like, what's the emergency that's emerging in research? Drawing on Donna Haraway, research creation scholar Natalie Lovelace writes that emergence, quote, describes an aggregate property of elements, none of which demonstrate that property inherently within them, end quote. So in so doing, she builds a case for the unknowability of what might emerge through research creation, as well as for an emergent transdisciplinarity of research creation as a growing field. So the theoretical framework I attempt to build myself to explain emergence happens on a whole host of levels, which include the relations between bodies and thoughts and social inheritances, genealogies of thought as part of materiality, and of course, what emerges in an event, in the time space of the event. And Stephanie Springer and I call that the speculative middle. I call my research creation projects events as a way of highlighting how research unfolds in practice. I conceptualize an event as a multitude of forces interacting and emerging as an event, including the people involved. I considered an emergence not just the materialization of an object or subject, but also accompanied by an ethico-political tending. In research, this means that each moment becomes charged with potentiality and also a necessity to respond in the moment. And I think that's where emergence meets emergency. And you can say, what's the emergency here? This is practical and speculative question that keeps the event in tension as it's ongoing. So I'm going to give an example of this happening in research. So this was a project. It was a 4-month in-school walking and writing creative project that I conducted with Year 9 students. I'm not going to explain the whole project. I just want to talk about how one thing that emerged in the event of research brought up new questions and new propositions and a new focus. As part of the studies, the students went for walks and composed Tonka poems about their experience. So a Tonka poem is a long line, one-line poem that's 31 syllables. And so they composed their own poems, but we were also reading Tonka poems that were authored by African-American poet Harriet Mullen, like Black Poetics, great poet. And so they were reading their own experiences, and we were reading Mullen's poems out loud. And emergent themes came out of these different writings. We were walking and reading these aloud. And what kept emerging was the intersections of race and gender in public space, the students' own experience, as well as what was coming up from Mullen's poems. And that wasn't premeditated. There's plenty of poems in Mullen's book that weren't directly talking about that, but that's what the students kept focusing on. And that was what was coming up in their own writings as well. And that was just this emergent, and Megan McClurk talks about that as data that glows, but it was just so obvious that this was kind of shifting, or not even shifting, because what I was doing in the project is we were doing a lot of walking and writing, and I was kind of waiting to see what was going to emerge and what was going to become the research focus. Because I had time to do that, and I'll get to that at the end, I think students are often not even allowed to have those kind of speculative experimental spaces, because we're supposed to know what we're looking for before we get there. Anyhow, that was emerging, and it also felt like an emergency. And so that's just a small example of that happening in a research project, and yeah, changing the direction of the research I think in an important and significant way. So that leads me to my next movement in research creation. And that's affirmation. So affirmation, I also frame it as refusal. So this is related to the previous 3. So thinking about speculation, activation, and emergence, as well as modes of responding to research events. And so in this instance, the event is the theories, planning, the engagement, and the writing up of the research. And as a researcher, I'm a member of the research event, as well as other forces and agencies and processes. But in that process, I feel like I need to be accountable and attuned to what's arising. And to conceptualize how I think about that, I settled on affirmation. I was going to use attunement, but then I decided to use affirmation. Similar to my writings about the concept of the inhuman, which I write about quite a bit, I understand affirmation is sort of paradoxically. There's a notion of negation inherent in it, because affirming one thing, you're probably negating others, or not affirming something else, or potentially deliberately refusing something else. Theories that I think through to build this concept include the affirmation of chance. Nietzsche and Derrida both write about that. Sedgwick's weak theory, friction and slowness by mostly Isabel Stengers and Kara Keeling, and then affirmative refusal, which has been theorized by Indigenous scholars Leanne Simpson and Jarrett Martineau. This affirmation or refusal is about the distribution of attention in the research event and research write-up. So what am I paying attention to? What am I foregrounding? What am I fostering? So we can think back to my example about the students, what's emerging in their own writings as we were out walking and writing. Affirmation means thinking critically about world-making practices I participate in, including research events, but also the politics of how I distribute my speculative, affective, and scholarly attention. So this would include who I cite, who I exclude, and who I think with to write up the research event. So this leads me to my last movement in the research creation project, which is more than representation. And plenty of people discuss more than representation. For me, research is concerned with the ways that I'm generating, especially in research creation, I'm generating rather than collecting or representing research data. And second, what occurs in the event might prompt further thought. And third, how reproducing those events, so the theories I think with, may engender further thought. In this way, writing about research projects is always more than and less than the events that occurred. And writing also is an event itself. Instead of that causing a crisis of recognition or representation or a closing down of meaning, I think we can view it as an opening. Some of the research creations I complete, the arts practice, for example, song composition, when I do that with Oblique Curiosities, the arts practice is the project and the more than representation of it. Recently, David Shannon and Catherine Yusoff and I wrote a song called Cosmic Beavers. And it's a song about transdimensional beavers who control time dams. And then they shred Lewis and Clark when Lewis and Clark are trying to go across Turtle Island. And then they use them to chink the dams. So we wrote this song as a speculative intervention into the future past. The song instantiates the theory, it represents the theory, and we haven't written like a scholarly article or anything about the song. We think we might, but as it stands right now, the song is the art and the research representation of it. So it's imbued with the theory. But I'm also an academic, and so there's usually a layer of scholarly writing and engagement that occurs as part of a research creation project. And these written outputs are interpretive, and on some level, they're also engaging with theory. And so that's why I call them more than representational. In writing, I attempt to think with aspects of the event in relation to the theory rather than close down meaning, and propose further things to think about. After McCormick, I view more than representational thought as a working with worldly relations in which thinking is already entangled in order to transform or recompose those relations anew. So you can think of it that way as well. I think that qualitative researchers or humanities scholars in general should recognize that we're all creating while we're writing. Research events and the empirical sites and the writing we're doing are radically empirical sites. So even thinking with theory or writing, we're creating worlds. And I think we should take that seriously. So that leads me to the final question, which was, I'm just gonna have a bit of tea here. What mechanisms could be put in place at universities to help supervisors and or committees support students doing post-philosophy inspired ways of inquiring? I don't really think my philosophies are post-philosophies. I got when you introduced today and said post-structural, I guess I do draw on post-philosophy. So, but I do engage with a lot of philosophers and philosophers' thoughts. And sometimes that's metaphorically, sometimes I'm trying to engage their theories in different ways. In order to help supervisors, I don't know if anyone's read this yet, but you've got to read Moten and Harney on supervision and the factory academy. It's great, and how it's modeled on a factory. So if supervisors are supervising students into the existing factory model, we're kind of already doomed. But let's see what could open up. So some things, I really am an advocate for reading. We need to allow students to read. We need to support reading. We need to encourage reading through reading groups. And we need to understand how long it takes to read and read well. We have to model reading practices, have reading groups, block out time in class for reading instead of making students do silly assignments to meet assessment criteria. Secondly, model this research in action. I was very fortunate to be part of research creation projects being enacted in schools when I was a graduate student, and parts of, in different publics, not just schools. Also, I've been part of reading groups since all through graduate school and since. I think we also have to allow grad students time to experiment when they're in graduate school. If they're not taught or allowed, or I don't know how to train people to experiment, but given the opportunity to experiment during graduate school, when do we think they're going to start? When they're precariously employed, when they're on the tenure track and having to tick particular boxes, like, yeah. In an academy that touts that there's a value in interdisciplinary and then punishes people for being interdisciplinary. So I really think we need to push back on that and help grad students cultivate that, or they'll just end up in the factory of the academy. I also think we should help students thinking with theory. If we in the social sciences didn't demand that empirical research always include other humans. Now, I know that not all qualitative research does do that, but there is a kind of a, I've noticed a trope in graduate research that there has to be an empirical study with some students in some school and education, or it's not deemed an educational research project. Of course, some people do policy work and things like that, but there does seem to still be this belief that it has to be enacted in a school. And I think students often go in and find out things they already know because they have to do a small scale study, and we already know that schools are racist and sexist and social reproductive. So what are we making them do these little projects for? What if we let them do something else that was a bit more theoretical? And I think there are potentially ways of engaging with theory or art practices themselves, similar to how the humanities work, and that could be a good skill to be developed and then get on a larger research project later. I don't know, I just think especially with COVID, we need to have other ways of conducting research for graduate students. I know a lot of students here have been held back because they're not, research in schools just been sort of shut down for the past 18 months almost now. So that's a lot of months in a 4-year program. So I wanted to just show one project that helped me think through theory and investigate research a question about ideation. And it was empirical research that I did by myself. It was just me. So this was a long distance postcard walking project. It took place along St. Cuthbert's Way, which is on the border of Scotland and England. And I conceptualized it around what was based on a practice called letterboxing. And letterboxing is a precursor to geocaching, where people used to leave postcards for themselves hidden on the moor, and other people would find them and then post them back to your house. So you'd write a postcard for yourself, and it's between you, and a stranger would post it to you. And so I walked St. Cuthbert's Way and wrote postcards to myself. And it was a walk, and in situ, I was writing to myself, and I was thinking about my own ideation process. As an enabling constraint, I limited my writing to one side of a card, and I also had my DSLR camera, had a pinhole aperture on it, and took pinholes. And I wrote about the emergence encounters that came up, and then I I further theorized this using queer theory, Derrida's postcard ontology of non-arrival, and it's written up as a theoretical chapter in my book. But it did actually help me think through ideation and theory. And I thought, well, I think it's an example of something a graduate student could do. I did it when I was a graduate student, and it's a good way of enacting an empirical project just by yourself. And I know autoethnography, and there are models of research that do this, but I think we could allow a bit more time for this for students. I also, on that walk, I did run a project at the same time with my friend Shani, and we composed songs, and I did also leave postcards for strangers, and I had ethics for that as well. So I had a bunch of different projects at the same time, and some of those did include other people, but I do think we could make a little bit more time or value students doing smaller projects that are theoretically engaging with an art practice by themselves. Yes, so that was an example of that. And I think that's the end of my responses. So yeah, I really wanted to just focus on research creation there because it was, I don't know, I just wanted an enabling constraint, but I also do qualitative research studies with students and teachers. And my research right now is mostly around English literary education and looking at how English literature in schools, although school educational research is often deemed social science, English literature is very much a humanities subject and very much intertextual and engaging with, you know, if you're reading a climate fiction text, there's so many other disciplines that are at work in reading that. It's funny how siloed things are in the field of education. So a lot of what I'm thinking about is how to build interdisciplinary links even in schools around literature specifically. So that's my current research right now. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Oh yeah, and that's me.
What's you? Thank you so much. You have covered a lot of the questions I was going to ask. You've given a real overview.
That's me, preemptive.
I know, you're always preemptive. There were a couple of things you left out which I was particularly interested in. One was your little blurbs on citations and the hyphen, which I thought you could say something about. And also speculative fiction and how that relates to research methods. And if you wanted to say something about hospitality, I'm quite interested in that. And I know other people in the room are also, and how you brought that into the letterboxing. So if you could just say a few words. I don't want to take up too much time because I think there will be, and I can see there are already questions for you. So you can choose to respond to any of that, Trumi.
Well, Viv, you read beyond the chapter that was, so Viv's referring to-
And the diffractive bots as well. I was quite intrigued.
Oh yeah, well, that's the whole, you're cutting the whole book. I was just talking about method. I do have some interstices throughout the book that about things that that kind of just not irritate me, but are on my mind a lot. One of them is about the concept of and one of them is about citational practices and how different concepts I think through to think about citation, and the other one is about hyphens and you know how, well, research creation itself is a hyphenated word, there's the conjunctive there, but also I was thinking about how a hyphen is a kind of forced milieu, you know, things get hyphenated, but it's kind of, it can be quite aggressive. Things can be hyphenated that may not want to be aggressive, might not want to be hyphenated. And so I was thinking about the ethics of that and how, what do we tether ourselves to? Do we tether ourselves to something when it's going well and we want to be carried along with whatever some new theory, or I think in the example in the book I'm talking about Black arts practices and indigenous resurgence, and then white people tethering ourselves to things when they're going well. We want to be co-implicated, but not want to be tethered when things aren't going so well. And so my proposition is to think about what you're hyphenated to, whether you want to stay hyphenated to it or you want to break some of those hyphens. That was just sort of something to consider about in how research operates, because it can be kind of well, capitalistic in that regard, conceptual capitalism or artistic capitalism. That was those speculative. Speculative. Well, just thinking about aspects of speculative fiction like defamiliarization, novum, and speculative world making and thinking, and how Liz DeFreitas and I have a paper.
Yeah,
about
no,
that.
she actually gave that as one of the readings, and I also heard about that because there was something.
Go watch Liz.
Sort of defending truth, and we had a discussion about that. I think in terms of research, I asked her about, well, how does that play out in research methods or research methodology?
Well, I think that, when you're speculating, you're luring things. But that's why I put the situatedness in there, because I really think we are speculating from a place, and the place we're speculating from, I think, is changing as we're doing it too, and changes by who we encounter and what we think, and probably what we have for dinner. But I do think we have to have a responsible speculation in that regard, and that's as far as like how speculative fiction operates. There's just so many modes of it, and there's so many different stories. In some ways, Liz and I were thinking through Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation.
Yeah,
and everything that's happening in the Southern Ridge theory, almost everything that's touched by what's going on there is mutating and changing form. You'll have to go read those books as well. But I think in some ways we're thinking about it metaphorically as an approach to conducting research. What was the other one? Oh, Derrida, hospitality.
Yeah, well, you don't have to engage.
Well, that was like, let us say yes to whatever turns up. His notion of Derrida's notion of hospitality. And then what's turning up, and have you read Barad's take on that in her, I think it's a 2020 or 2019 article, where she talks about decolonialism and the island. I can't remember what it's called now, but she goes into that, and she's sort of quite critical of his notion. Have you seen that? Difficult. Yeah, it's a difficult notion. I don't know if I settled on whether I liked it or not. Well, that's where the refusal comes in too, right? At some, maybe you do have to who can sit back and watch anything unfurl. So there is a privilege in that, but I think it troubled me as I was going. And if you read that postcard chapter of things encountered on the walk, and it's like, do I want to, but I don't want to turn away from bad things that are happening too, but how much do you take on, and what are you hospitable for too? There's a kind of openness to it, but also I think there's a necessity for some criticality there, and also, the ability to refuse if that's what needs to happen. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Candace now, because I think I'd like you to give other people an opportunity. Okay, Viv.
Thanks,
hold on. I just want to tell everybody that it's almost 11 p.m. So everybody's aware that I'm going to turn into a pumpkin in 4 minutes.
A little preface before you try to answer questions on the fly here. So I want to let all of our attendees know, please, in the Q&A little button at the bottom of the screen, go ahead and start populating your questions there. And myself and Erin will take some turns asking Sarah those questions. There is one that popped up in the chat box, so I'm going to start with that before I forget that it's there, and then we'll move to the ones that are in the Q&A box. So we have a question. Can you talk, or just a request, I guess, can you talk a little bit more about the problems of process without constraints? So the problems of process without constraints.
Oh, okay, so yeah, I often just look at why do we need some constraints? Well, it's enabling constraints. I feel like you need some. If you don't have any constraints and you're trying to write a song, it's just going to be like there's no scale. There's like everything in the kitchen sinks in there, and so if you're enacting some kind of a project, whatever it is, whoever asks is probably a pedagogue potentially. Like we need constraints usually when we're giving students an assignment of what we want them to produce for us or for themselves. So yeah, the anything goes. You know, if you want to do an anything goes dance to loosen up at the beginning of a class or a session, maybe that's fine. But usually at some point you're going to need to set some constraints, or I don't know what. I don't think anything really interesting will happen. That's not the great answer, but I just always feel like I need some constraints in research, or I don't even know what I'm researching.
So I think that ties back to two things you mentioned. As I was making notes, it was funny because then you went there on so many.
I preempted.
Like enabling constraints. So you asked, how do I prime myself to be affected? And I had jotted a little side note to myself, enabling constraints. But I'm wondering if the person who asked that was maybe talking about how you mentioned not having an anything goes approach, and basically that framing for emergence. So the person who asked it is a visual artist, so I'm
sure they know exactly what I mean. Well, they should ask them, like, how do you set about doing your visual art? I'm not a visual artist, but you probably have a pencil or a paint. Like, you're not going to have a pencil, paintbrush, and everything all in one. Like, I guess, is that Jackson Pollock who just squiggles? But even that, there's an enabling constraint there. There's gravity, there's the paper, there's a couple different colors. There's a lot of enabling constraints there. And it's not anything goes at all.
I wish that this is one time when I wish that we had the live format so that she could.
Me too.
On that.
Well,
and follow up on that.
And I would say in the chat box, feel free if there's more that wants to go back and forth about that is a space for now. Erin, do you want to jump into the next question that's in our Q&A box?
Sure.
Well, it was Nikki. Nikki, you know that stuff. You're just causing trouble at 11.
So the next question is, there's an appreciation for your intensity, and also the need for enabling constraints as a means to maintain some anyway, the person says how they wonder how you're thinking with the eternal return might be related to slowing down and returning to the body, to nature, or maybe just how you're thinking about eternal return and why it haunts you.
Yeah, well, I don't really think about it as a returning to the body, but that could very much be how someone thinks about it. I think about it as this, well, how it comes up in the text. What if a demon came up to you in your loneliest of lonelies and told you that your life as you have lived it, you're going to live it again eternally forever? And then do you go nihilistic? Do you accept that? And then accepting the affirmation of that great burden is a kind of overcoming. And then I just vacillate on it. Yeah, it seems so constrained in its recurrence. And then what will I do? How will I engage with that? And I sometimes think that I have to affirm it and then I will overcome it. And then sometimes I just feel really sort of nihilistic about it. And I still don't exactly know what I think about it. And it's not, I don't feel like it's a returning to the body and being in the moment. It's a really kind of like affective feeling of potential nihilism. Yeah, but then a responsibility of that, and responsibility of the moment, and then a kind of peace that comes with that as well, which is, I guess, the affirmation of the burden of it, and a taking responsibility of my life up until now. And so yeah, that's the amor fati of it, I guess. And so I talk about that actually in this chapter too, even with the thought of what theorists I draw from. And, you know, I'm a scholar and I'm always reading. I'm like, oh man, I wish I knew this when I did that 2 years ago. But I really feel like I need to, just take responsibility for where I was when, and also my inheritances, my scholarly inheritances, which are very, very Euro-Western, except I did study Chinese Buddhism and lived in China for 3 years. And I did notice that I barely have any, I feel like that infuses my thinking, but I haven't really written about it in this book anyway. And so, yeah, that's part of it as well, just accepting, but not in a kind of despondent way, but accepting my inheritances. And then if you think of the eternal return, if this is the crux where everything's returning to, and I have ability to change or to do something different, then that's going to eternally recur too. So there's this choice in the moment. So yeah, I think about it quite a bit in all sorts of different ways, but yeah, probably in a more stoic rather than nihilistic sense. Hope that answered the question, but definitely I should, yeah, maybe I don't think about it as returning to the body.
So Nikki did post another comment in the chat box, so I will follow up to the previous question on enabling constraint. So she's wondering whether anything goes could actually be an enabling constraint itself, and wondering whether the research has to produce something interesting.
Yeah, I agree completely. No, anything goes could be an enabling constraint for sure. I think I was kind of doing that as more of a caveat to, because there was a lot of theories proliferating in that area, and I was thinking, somebody could read this and think I'm saying anything goes, which of course I am, and of course I'm not. Nikki, anything you can do, anything goes, of course, as an enabling constraint. And no, I don't think it has to produce something interesting. And what I think is interesting, probably not other people might not think are interesting either. So.
Thanks for that. Erin, you want to do our next question that's populated?
Yes, there was a question to expand on issues of ethics and politics of representation, and how research creation may disrupt normative colonial logics of representational research, more than representation, but also in the so-called outputs, what gets valued by academia. The publishing for collective research creation is still the individuals who author and represent, this person is saying, build their careers on research creations of those who've worked together. So could you speak to how that's negotiated?
Yeah, well, I can't speak for whoever might be doing that, but I would say in larger research creation projects that I've been involved with Walking Lab, if we're working with artists, they're paid, and that's upfront. Smaller projects that I've done with like students in school and things like that, it's pretty much, I call it research creation because there's cultural production there, but it'd be similar to somebody going in and doing a study with the students. They do get things out of doing things differently in class. They're going to be in class anyway. So I don't know if that, I don't feel like that's a really extractive mode of working with young people. But yeah, I guess it could get extractive depending on who's doing it and who they're doing it with, and yeah, whether people are paid or whether people have a voice in how things are rendered or represented. Yeah, academics build their careers on all sorts of other people's suffering and disasters around the world as well, and writing about them. So yeah, I think there's an ethics of engagement when you're doing research with people, whether it's artistic or ethnographic or anything. So I think that ethic would go through it completely. As far as yeah, the academy and what it values, it really does just seem to value Q1 journal articles. So there's that crisis of representation that I don't think research creations got around at all. Yeah, a lot of the projects that I do that are just pure art, that are the arts instantiating the theory, they're not valued in the academy really, that I know of. So I think that's a real problem. And me as a scholar, yeah, what's probably more valued for me is my more qualitative research, and I guess theorizing, and so I can get that published in writing about this in article Q1 journals or whatever, or books. But if you think people on the tenure track or whatever's happening, they're probably, I don't know how easily you can make a career just doing research creation. I don't think people have an easy time doing a career doing anything in anything in the academy right now, though. So maybe research creation is just fine. But yeah, definitely, as far as writing up research, it's a lot easier to write up the qualitative research that I'm doing around literary education than research creation. That sounds discouraging after my whole talk, but it's a good way of thinking about things still. And the interdisciplinarity of it should be valued.
So I want to follow up to a comment that Viv made really early in the webinar today, was about the new book that's coming out and kind of feeling novel-like, or feeling like she couldn't put it down. And as I read this first chapter, that was your suggested reading, I really felt that too. And I think what I would love to hear you just talk a little bit about your kind of writerly moves and how you chose to approach writing it. What I really found that I loved was your footnotes in the chapters were just these raw, vulnerable, kind of transparent, kind of risky comments. Maybe somebody might claim that, that I could really feel like I was at a coffee shop at a table, and you kind of given me these side conversations about what was in the actual kind of more formal part of the text. So would love to hear just more from a writing stance, like how you approached it and what you were hoping that this chapter and book would produce, in the world through the way that you chose to author it.
Yeah, I pretty much write like that's how I write when I'm not writing with another person. Because I do co-publish a lot, so that's pretty much me, how I write. And I did when I decided to, a lot of this is some of it's from my dissertation, a lot of it's from my dissertation actually at University of Toronto, which is written in the same voice. But when I decided to do it, I had grad students in my mind. I think the version you have, I don't know if it has the title page, but I dedicated this to grad students. That's who I was thinking of when I was writing it. And so I felt like I was sort of talking to them, because I do even speak in yous a lot, some we's and then some I's. That's me. Yeah, so that was pretty much how I think. I just kind of wanted to write in that mode, and I'm glad that translated. Hannah Shakespeare at Routledge said something similar, and so yeah, that's nice to hear. Thank you for that. And I think people should write like that more if they want to, just write about how you're thinking about things. And I'm constantly questioning myself as I'm doing things, and so sometimes I would check that in the footnotes. Sometimes it's in the main text too. I think. What I haven't done is read it for a while because I'm sick of it. But I did enjoy writing it.
We didn't get
and the postcards are like that a lot too. I'm always sort of thinking that way. Sorry, Erin. Sorry, Erin.
No. I was going to say we didn't get the dedication page, but certainly I think I can sympathize with that. You know, writing and thinking in layers. I leave comments to myself in other layers in the document.
Yeah, before we get to the next question, I just want to say, I think what I appreciate about that writerly move, especially thinking of graduate students as kind of the audience, that your primary audience, is it does show, I think a lot of times we try to clean up academic manuscripts and there's like a tightness and cleanness to it where we don't always hear the backstory or the complexity or the things that somebody's still wrestling with. And so I appreciated that transparency that I'm not sure that we always see, like in those kind of top academic publishing places where reviewers really want us to kind of know what we're saying and why, in a way that you really showed that messiness of thought. And so I really appreciated that move that you made.
Oh, thanks. I hope it's not so messy it doesn't make sense.
No.
It was perfect.
It's so messy, it's anything goes. There you go, Nikki. It's anything goes.
I think you made that point a lot in the book, saying that anything doesn't go.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
well, then all
the word sharing. I'm not sharing on that anything goes.
So that does kind of segue into our next question, which is, how do we determine quality, or some might say rigor, in research creation if working against that anything goes approach? And then I would also extend that by saying, how do we make distinctions or recognize good quality, and this person did put it in quotes, work, when we're looking at the written product or the report or the sharing of that research creation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I don't know if I have an entire answer for it. Like, I do feel like, I think I say in the book, when you're talking about, there's artistic rigor, just like, I think, do I have the quote, we don't just do parameciums? Like, you don't just decide you're a biologist one day and just start throwing parameciums underneath microscopes or something like that. Just like me chucking a bunch of paint at the wall probably wouldn't be art. Like Nikki, someone who's a trained artist would say, okay, Sarah, that's nice, but people go to school for many years and train up in these things or whatever it is. So I think we should take our artists and musicians and writers and people who have training and experience seriously for that, just like we do for scientists or teachers, and then obviously you don't want to get into some sort of white Euro-Western notion of value and art. And so I think there's ways of pushing back on that as well. But then, how do you do it in situ? And I don't have an entire response to that, but I do feel like even the ethical political orientations to what's being conducted and how it's being conducted, like maybe the art's not perfect or wonderful, but a person about how do we deal with research participants, they're being taken care of, and so there might be different levels of rigor and value and quality that are going on there. And it is interdisciplinary. It's art, it's the theory, and it's the research process all kind of happening together. And maybe not all of them are, I don't know, A+, but there's an attempt at some kind of rigor there. I don't have an exact response beyond that. I think that's part of what's wrestling, but I think that's the same. And how do some things end up in Q1 journals? Who evaluated that? So I think rigor's one of those words that is a floating signifier in some ways. But I feel like, we have to have maybe an internal rigor. Maybe that's it.
I wonder too how much of that comes back to, very much related to representation, but just the transparency of how did I set myself up, or how did we set ourselves up to be affected, and sharing some of those parameters that were loosely or very, very definitively put in place for the speculative middle.
Mm-hmm. And then some parts, like some things, like I feel like I theorized research creation as a process at the beginning of the book, and they're all research creation projects, but then elements of them are not, and elements of how I'm writing them up are certainly not in the book, especially the in-school research. A lot of it, that's in some ways just ethnographic research or sensory ethnography happening as well. So I kind of flow in and out of it myself. I think maybe someone in an art faculty at university would have a completely different understanding of it than I do. But I feel like those of us in social sciences do think about method and methodology maybe a lot more than people in the arts and humanities might. So yeah, trying to bridge that as well.
So I was gonna, go ahead, Erin.
No, that's okay, go ahead.
I was gonna invite any of our attendees, if they have a final question that they want to make sure that we get to. We're getting close to our time here soon. So if you have a question that you want us to pose to Sarah, please be sure to go ahead and type that in, and we'll make sure we get to that. Erin, did you have a follow-up comment there, a question?
I did. So I actually have my own question. Interestingly, Candace and I had not talked about the writing at all. And the thing that struck me most was also the footnotes. My husband and I were just talking last night about how in most of my writing, the footnote is not the typical structure. It's not built in, and just the luxury of having that space of a footnote. But many of our questions in previous webinars have been about protecting graduate students or resisting in the ways that we structure essentially our work, or protecting from an advisor point of view, protecting that space. So for people in spaces or institutions that may not value research creation, your footnotes about methodology really stood out to me, but it begs the question for me, thinking of honoring some of those questions that have been asked in previous webinars. What advice would you give to either people supporting graduate students or to graduate students themselves if they are really having to resist the process of the academy in wanting to do things that look differently? Yeah.
Well, in some ways, if you look at the rendering of that book, that's a fairly normal, other than my overzealous footnotes, that's an academic book. Maybe my writing style is a little bit different. And so I think, I don't know what you do if you're not even allowed to do the projects. I think maybe you don't do your PhD there, wherever there is. Maybe people should shop around, but then also they might not know that they don't want to do that until they get in graduate school. But so how are they encountering this? But go study with Candace. There are people doing things or that would allow this, and probably people, even if it's not Candace, people in that faculty that would at least understand this. I feel like I don't know what to do if you find yourself with a supervisor that's a positivist or whatever. You maybe should switch supervisors, or you just put your head down and join the factory. I don't, that's not very good advice, but, and how would the supervisors do it? Well, if they're tenured, they should have the capacity to support their students, I would say, or they shouldn't be taking on these kinds of students, really. It's not fair.
Do you mind sharing? Earlier you talked about the Factory Academy article. I think it was on one of your slides. Are you able to type in the chat box again that information? I tried to Google it, but I'm not finding it. So I was
sorry, Candace. What it is, I think it's the opening chapter of Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's new book that's not even out yet.
Oh, okay.
So the first chapter I think this is where I read it, is about that. Because
Okay.
it's kind of their follow-up from the Undercommons, and they're talking about how the Undercommons wasn't just about the university, it wasn't even about the university, but that's what they were writing in the university. So of course it became about the university.
Okay, that's
yeah.
helpful. Okay, we'll look
Yeah,
for that
sorry.
first
Yeah,
chapter.
I don't know. Can't remember what it's called. I think I might have shared it on Twitter like a couple months ago. So I'll look.
Okay.
Yeah, that wasn't very helpful, was it? I didn't even put the.
No, it's okay. I was looking for an article, but that's helpful to know it's the
I
first
think it's a
chapter of
book
an
chapter.
upcoming book. Okay,
Yeah.
great. So a comment from Nikki in the chat box is just to let you know that she agrees with enabling constraints. She's trying to think more about the relationship between process and product, and that what we produce has effects that matter, and that process needs to be attended to this. So that was another follow-up to that. And then it looks like the book might be posted.
All incomplete. That's
Okay.
it.
All right,
Yeah.
thanks, Liva, for that as well. So we have that if people want to look in the chat box. So we're about out of time. Viv or Erin, do you have any other questions that you want to ask? I think we've gotten to all that were in our Q&A box, but I don't know, Viv, if you have a follow-up, because I know you had lots of questions that you had thought about for today.
I'm just conscious of the time there, and I
Yeah.
think we must let our
Viv,
guest
let
go a
Sarah
little
go to
let's
sleep.
say
earlier.
what the time is. I want to say that it's 11:23 p.m.
Yeah, well, it's we have about 7 minutes left, and we still have to talk about you know, our next webinar and that sort of thing. But I just wanted to say how much I appreciated what you had to say about the academy, because that didn't come from your book. And I just feel that you have a freshness and also sort of a close experience to having sort of recently gone through some of these processes. So, and I so much that it resonated with me, the reading in class. I found that absolutely helping students to read, you know, whatever level they're at, and even academics, you know, to read aloud is fantastic. So thanks so much for thinking about those things.
That is, I think, in my actual intro to the book, I do talk about reading, because it's called "What Do Books
I
Have to
remember
Do with
that.
Education?" Which was posed to me. What do books have to do with education?
That was posed to you?
Yeah, when I wanted to join the book history program from Boise. What do books have to do with education? So that's the name. That's the title of my intro, and there is reading is pushed in that as well. What a funny thing to push for, reading.
Yeah.
Well, before Viv shares with us about the upcoming webinar and closes us off today, I just want to say thank you so much for working with us to find a time across all these time zones that would work, and for all those who are going to watch this on YouTube in the future. I'm so grateful that you were a part of our webinar series today to share a little bit about your upcoming book and the projects that you're a part of. So thanks so much, Sarah.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
And thanks to all the people that I couldn't talk to. Thanks, Nikki.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for attending. And I'm sure people will find this very interesting. I know some people said they couldn't attend and they're looking forward to seeing the YouTube video.
And feel free to email me, people, if you want to talk or whatever. You can
Thank
email
you
me.
so much.
Yeah.
That's great.
Do I hang up now or no?
No, well, you can, but we just, well, you probably know about the next webinar, and you probably know that the YouTube, you know, will be available quite soon as Erin has sort of gone through it and got it together. So we will post about that. And you know that David Ben Shannon, is going to be talking on August the 19th. He probably will be fast asleep then.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're looking forward to him too. And it's going to go back to that original time, which is 9:30 a.m. Central Time in the US and 4:30 p.m. in Cape Town. And yeah, so always check the website to see what's going on, because we do put suggested readings in there, and you will see those also on the website. And if you're wanting to get hold of them, I suggest you contact Erin Price, and you know, her details are there. So thanks very much. It's been so enjoyable, and thanks for all the work you put into the presentation and for saving me asking you the questions.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well,
okay, now I'm going. Okay.
You can go to sleep now. Thanks, Sarah. Good night,
Bye.
Sarah.
Okay, take care, everyone. See you next time. Bye.
bye-bye.
Bye.